In Python, especially in Python 3, everything is an object, and an object has identity. The identity of an object is a unique ID, a unique number, which is specific to that particular object and no other object. This can be an important consideration when we're considering things like immutable objects. And so Python has an ID function, a built-in function, for finding the identity of an object. This is the Python shell. It's idle, which is the graphical interface to the Python shell. On graphical environments like Windows and a Mac and some forms of Linux that have a graphical shell, you will have this graphical shell for Python included with your Python distribution. In other environments that don't have a graphical shell, you will have simply the Python command line interpreter, which if you just type Python by itself, you'll get this same interface. So we're going to start here by creating an object, and I'm going to call it x, and I'm going to give it a value 42. Now when I type x by itself, I will get the value 42, and if I type ID of x, I get that object's ID. So this is the ID of the immutable object, which is the integer 42. If I type of x, I see that its class is int, and so the x itself is simply a reference to the object, which is of type int and has the value 42 and has the ID that is this 505.409.528. In fact, if I just type ID of 42, I get exactly that same ID. And if I type of 42, I get class int. So the number 42 is an object. And that object has ID, it has type, and it has value, just like any other object. So if I create another variable, call it y, and assign it the value 42, the ID of y is going to be exactly the same. Of course, if I test for equality x equals y, I'll get true. But I can also test them for being exactly the same object. And that's with the is operator. I can say x is y, and they are exactly the same object because they have the same ID. The is operator simply compares the IDs rather than comparing the values. The double equal sign, which is this one here, compares values to see if the values are the same. The is operator compares the IDs to see if they refer to exactly the same object. So let's say that I have a mutable dictionary. And I say x equals dictionary, and I'll just give it x equals 42. And so I now have a dictionary object. And I say type of x, and it's a dictionary object. I type x, and I get that, which is the dictionary object. And I type ID of x, and it is this. Now, if I create another dictionary object, and I say y equals dictionary, and I say x equals 42, I give it exactly the same contents, and I say ID of y, I have a different ID. And this is because a dictionary object is a mutable object. And so there's no reason, in fact, it would make life more difficult if by simply assigning the same content to a dictionary, Python were to give me exactly the same object. X and Y are still references that point to objects. But these two objects, even though they have exactly the same value, if I say x, I get that. If I say y, I get that. Those are exactly the same value. These are different objects. So I can test for x equals y, and I get true. If I test for x is y, I get false because it's pointing to two different objects. So these can become important distinctions, and we'll see some examples as we go into our examples of working code in Python. We'll see some examples of where you would use something like this. But at this point, what's important for you to understand is what ID is. That ID is a unique ID that refers to a specific object, and how to test for the equality of ID with the is operator to see if two different variables, and remember, variables are references to objects, to see if two different variables refer to exactly the same object.